All right. Welcome to episode 15 of GitOps the Planet. I am your host, as always. My name is Dan Garfield. I'm the co-founder and chief open source officer of a wonderful company called CodeFresh, where we make CI/CD and GitOps and all the best ways to deliver software possible. Today's topic is going to be an interesting one because we are going to be talking about AI, so it is certainly the hot thing to discuss. And I know that I've already been getting quite a bit of value out of AI and also have seen some interesting trends happening. So I'm excited to get into those with our special guest today. His name is Alex Jones, and he is the creator of K8's GPT or Kubernetes GPT, which is probably the first CNCF project that actually has a GPT interface added to it, which is wonderful. I know that it's had a pretty big impact at a lot of companies, and been laughing recently about all the different people talking about their new job roles. And my favorite one is prompt engineer as a job title. I'm a prompt engineer, and I see these ebooks that are out there that are like, here are some amazing prompts you can use for AI, which is a pretty funny way to approach engineering. So any housekeeping? As you have questions, I see some people are joining in on different platforms. As you have questions, post them in the chat. We'll be sure to get into them. Make sure your friends are invited. Go ahead and repost this and share it. We really appreciate that. Go ahead and subscribe on the different platforms, whichever one you're tuning in on. That definitely helps. And without any further ado, I want to bring in Alex. Welcome, Alex.
Hey, Dan. Nice to meet you. How's it going?
Good. Nice to meet you officially. I've interacted with you a little bit on Twitter, and I always thought this guy seems super cool and seems to, have a really good beat on the space. And, generally I noticed that you have pretty positive interactions with people, which is something that I always appreciate on Twitter, because there are people who are very popular because of their ability to dunk on and squish people, which is, don't get me wrong, it's entertaining. That can be entertaining. But I always definitely appreciate people that are bringing a positive vibe and a positive spin to the community. So thank you for that.
I try my best. I think also, I look at Twitter as being another facet of my professional profile rather than kind of just for personal stuff. And some people see it the other way around, right? And it depends completely on the way you view that social media platform. But for me, because I interact with a lot of open source people on there as well, I try to sort of have a level of decorum and sort of be nice and reasonable. And, maybe that's a little bit tame, but at the same time, I think it provides somebody who's at least reliable. And I try to tweet stuff that makes sense.
Now, I feel like Facebook is the place to go to act like an insane uncle,
Yeah.
and spout all kinds of craziness, whereas Twitter is a little bit more like, I just want to talk about ideas with people. I want to be stuff that I'm interested in. And there's a lot of like navel gazing that doesn't really help anyone. So today's topic is definitely forward facing. I mean, we're going to be talking about GPT and AI and the impact that we expect it to have on the industry and DevOps. So you actually created K8's GPT, and I think you have the first commit on it. And then so maybe for the people that haven't heard of it, do you want to give like a brief intro, and I can throw up some stuff on the screen too, if that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So K8's GPT, the name rides the wave of ChatGPT, but really the functionality is quite different. Its primary function is to help SREs and DevOps engineers to triage and remediate issues faster, right? Many people acquire a lot of organizational and tribal knowledge over time when they become an SRE. I just know that thing means this. And we're often really bad at writing it down. And run books are really unhelpful a lot of the time when you're in an incident. So if you can have a tool that gives you kind of hints and shortcuts to figure out some of these issues, then that's going to be really valuable. And so really, K8's GPT, I started writing a year or so ago in the format of just a simple SRE tool where you could codify a lot of these checks. What OpenAI and Bard and Azure OpenAI and all these other public inference APIs suddenly made available was this idea of using AI to take the context and the error messages and to bring them to the next level of actually simplifying what those error messages are saying. So rather than me having to do all that legwork, the AI can look at all of that corpus of data where it's seen error messages before and start to give you some really good and actually kind of useful responses in how to start to think about triaging problems that you see. It's available as a CLI and as an operator. One of the things I'm really proud of is there's no company behind it, right? Like this is completely open source. There's 38 different contributors, all from different companies, and we just all want to be able to build something in public that is free and available for everyone to use.
And I think you work for Amazon, is that right?
I work for Canonical. So the folks who bring you Ubuntu, OpenStack, and I specifically am an engineering director for Kubernetes there. So micro-K8s.
Did you previously work for Amazon, or am I just mixing things up entirely?
I think you're mixing stuff up here. I work for a bunch of companies. Amazon's not one of them yet.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So you're working at Canonical, and were they supportive of you spinning up just a totally open, essentially side project because it's not a Canonical project? Did they want it to be a Canonical project?
So actually, one of the things that I'm discussing with is bringing it in as a charm, and a charm is kind of like part of our charm Kubernetes offering is this ability to have like an operator version of the tooling. And because of the way Canonical is structured and the long history of open source and hacking, people kind of have this mindset of, yeah, go out and try ideas, make things that are good for the community. For example, you may not know this, but micro-K8s started as a side project, like a weekend project with how do I take a Kubernetes and package it in a snap? And suddenly we have a super popular 100K a day user Kubernetes platform. So yeah, I've got a lot of support. And what's really nice is that people are already finding ways to use it internally at work for debugging and triaging issues.
So it wasn't, so that's like a normal thing, like with micro-K8s, somebody started it literally as just a side project and then said, hey, we can bring it in as a Canonical thing.
So I think, I can only speak to my own experience, but there's usually a good amount of discretion on terms of like, hey, this is something you just want to keep it as an open source project. That's cool. Or this could have commercial value. Do you want to spend and get paid and do some of your time on it? A bit like the old Google 80-20 kind of rule. And in that circumstance, the micro-K8s, it was like a side project that let's actually put some funding behind it and some engineering hours and make it an official product. And I think that was really fun because the engineer who did that then got to work on that and see it through to a really cool project, a bit like the early days of things like Gmail, right? And then become a real success.
That's pretty unique. I mean, like most companies have pretty strict inventions clauses, and it's like you don't, if you want to work on something separate, like you can, but like you need to get like permission or something like that. So it sounds like that's pretty unique to Canonical.
So no, well, I think there's a level of pragmatism involved in the sense that you can create something, on your own laptop, on your own time on the weekend with like MIT licenses. And as long as you're sensitive of not doing things with work technologies on work laptops in work time, then it's been pretty okay. I mean, I've worked at previous companies who have had a similar philosophy. As long as it's not in our subject matter space, competing with a product on work time, then you're okay. But I don't want to get myself in legal trouble by misquoting anything here. But yeah, I've been very fortuitous in terms of my opportunities.
Yeah, it's definitely very nice. I actually had a chance to use this the other day because I was having an issue with my home cluster where basically it's kind of interesting because most Kubernetes is in the cloud. And so I run into some unique, actually, hang on, I don't put that up yet. I run into some unique issues because I run a Kubernetes home lab, which is like, I had a brownout the other day, and one of my nodes didn't reboot for some reason. And when you have Kubernetes have an ungraceful shutdown like that, it thinks everything is still running, even because kubelet, like kubelet's not reporting. So it just assumes it's running. And then basically I suddenly everything just started exploding all over my cluster, and all my stateful sets started failing and stuff. So it took me a while to figure out, but I actually did use K8s GPT to help explain stuff. And so I wanted to show you, this is what it's currently reporting on my cluster. Now, these two things aren't issues really, but what I really like about this is that for an issue that it calls out, and like it's specifying that, hey, this doesn't have a service, it's referencing a service that doesn't exist. And then it actually says, it lists out different remediation things I can do. And Honestly, I find that really helpful because lots of times you see an error message and your first thing you do is you Google it and then you search through comments and then you basically find suggestions like this from different commenters. So to have it I just skipped 10 steps to get to, oh, here's the kind of the next things I should train on, I should do. That feels really valuable to me. So um, within this feature set, I mean, have you seen a huge adoption curve, interest? Have you had some real life stories that people have shared of how this has helped them beyond the one that I just shared with you?
Oh yeah, for sure. And actually, there's a secondary flag you can add in there, which is -D, and that gives you the official Kubernetes documentation on the resource type that's actually failed, right? So, for example, it will describe what is the service name,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the service name, and it will give you the blurb from the top of that, and that was contributed to us from somebody, I believe, who worked at SAP, or it might have been Spotify actually, but they were saying that there is still a level of prior understanding involved, and of course, we need to be reasonable here. But if you add these things in, yeah, for precisely, this is really starting to build almost like a guardrails of, let's say I'm a new SRE to Kubernetes, that makes a big difference to me, right? If I can just keep reminding myself and figure out that these things are documented and understand that these constructs can be understood, it really, really assists and helps us. And in fact, like with a commercial product, you get what we call PLG, right? Product-led growth. We have effectively features that are brought in by demand. In a similar way, with KGPT, many of the features that we're seeing have been brought in by user demand. We've actually got users at Alibaba, and one of the things I did was add in language, so it supports Mandarin as well. And of course, that was super easy with a lot of these inference APIs having multi-language agnostic outputs. So we now have a flag. You can set your language. So really, the way I've seen it evolve is in the usability of it, and see that people are sort of bringing little features that are making a huge difference at their organization.
And I noticed that. So another approach that I thought was pretty cool is it's not tied specifically to OpenAI. You can use it really with any prompt enabled model. Was that something that you wanted to do from day one, or is that another thing that was kind of user added? They said, hey,
oh yeah. So this was absolutely from day one. I wouldn't have ever started the project unless I knew that it could be decoupled from a proprietary service. If you look at the code, it uses an interface to all AI. OpenAI was just the first publicly available implementation to program against. However, what we're seeing now is that a lot more people want to use our local AI support, which is for models you run on your own computer, right? So as Hugging Face, the French startup who have a lot of these models, have started releasing things like GPT-4all. We're also seeing Facebook and Llama and these other models are coming out for free. We're seeing a really interesting trend in the market where the open source community's ability to train models quickly is far outstripping these commercial platforms, and so therefore people want to use local models. And yeah, we're now seeing that our local AI backend support is just skyrocketing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and something that I've been playing around with a little bit has been like that Hugging Face, Open Chat, and these other ones. And it seems like there was a leak from Google a little while ago. They leaked some memos internally where they talked about the fact that there was nothing defensible in AI right now, that they could essentially mimic and recreate all of this stuff with open source. And coming to Hugging Face, they just released so that they have this open chat, and they just updated their evaluation, and they say that they have 105% of GPT-4 evaluation in scoring. And I don't know how accurate that is. I've seen people talk about this and say, yeah, it's just really good at mimicking the style of voice of ChatGPT. It's not actually as intuitive and creative as ChatGPT is. But I wasn't sure if that was like, just smoke or if that's real. So I don't know if you've evaluated these different models, but.
So I think that the way the models are being changed is changing dramatically from GPU approach to potentially even CPU-based training. But also we're starting to think about building more specific models for situations. These are often called task-orientated, right? So task-oriented AI. And with that comes the ability to have a more narrow subset of parameters, right? So instead of 12 billion parameters, you could take that down to perhaps 300 million or so. And what that lets you do is to start to build AI that really synthesize the kind of outputs that you're looking for, and mimicry outputs. OpenChat, however, is the kind of more classical approach of looking at being a real LLM like ChatGPT with DaVinci and with GPT 3.5 Turbo. But the challenge there is that they are also going to have to consume a very large corpus of data to train those models on, because legally now, OpenAI has said we don't want people training models off of our API, which is actually something people were starting to do for a very brief window of time.
Yeah.
And so I think really one of the key issues that's going to really stifle adoption of these commercial models and even some of these pre-trained models in the open source world is just where did the data come from, whose data is it, and how was it trained? Because I think that's the new horizon that we're facing, is that any model you didn't train yourself, it's very difficult to understand exactly what its pedigree is and where it's come from. So even OpenChat, you got to ask the question, how was it trained?
I'm not sure if I've seen anybody that has the right heuristic for thinking about training models licensing, because if I think about AI in terms of artificial intelligence, it's what it is. If I have a person, they go to Cornell and they study with these professors and they read these books, and when they come out of that and they do all of this research and they read all these different things, they have this corpus of knowledge that now we feel belongs to them. That's they went and learned it. That was their part. That knowledge existed. They paid for access. They paid in time. Maybe they had to pay to go to university. Maybe they just joined a library and they just exist as a person, whatever it is. But that knowledge, once they've consumed it, it's theirs and it's not someone else's. And it seems like this is kind of blurring the line between copyright, where it's like, hey, you can't reprint somebody else's book without permission, but you can generate a book that learned off of this model, that you can generate a new book off of reading several other books. And so did they violate copyright in doing that? Or is there, do they owe royalties or some kind? Because I don't owe royalties, right? For my learning experience, I don't owe royalties to my third grade teacher who helped me learn how to read or whatever. You know what I mean? So I don't know that I've heard anybody come out with a heuristic that makes sense to me to say OpenAI shouldn't be allowed to read the open internet without paying for people. It's like, well, you made it open. They were allowed to read it. Even if they just paid, a single user seat for their AI to go and learn something, it seems like that would be fair game. But I don't know if you've heard a better heuristic for this.
I think it's, so firstly, no. But I was just thinking about, with the things that are going on with companies like Reddit, right, where they're locking down the API because people are training AI off of it. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that with Twitter as well, right? And so many companies, I think, are responding to this by taking away the ability to have the cheap, API access and start to build models based off that. And I don't know necessarily if that's the most sustainable solution. Also, I think, just back to your university example, there's a really stark difference between knowledge and intelligence, right? These AI are effectively knowledge bases. They're crystallized finite state machines, effectively.
Yeah.
If you could map every single parameter in and find every single permutation of that parameter, you would understand every single outcome permutation, right? Where the differentiator happens is in the temperature and the amount of chaos and randomness that you can inject. And part of that processing and learning phase is where we're starting to see the innovation, right? You came, I think you mentioned, or might have come across that idea of the novel solution in AI, where they come out with a novel solution, and that's the intelligence part, right? Actually taking some context and coming out with something that wasn't already pre-programmed. And I think as we start to really invest, hundreds of thousands of hours from AI researchers and machine learning and data scientists, every day of the year across the world, we're going to start to see that these models are iterating faster and faster and really starting to show the signs of having novel solutions. And as I mentioned earlier, with task-oriented AI specifically. Now, as to a heuristic around the actual quality of the data, I think there will be a way of actually embedding the programming data that you're using, and the weights that are being trained against, as almost like an SBOM, right? Almost a way of mapping how that model has been created. But I don't have the answer here today, but I suspect that it will be something that with enough demand, there'll be a way of almost like having a signature to attest that where the data has come from. And just one final remark is that there are already companies who let you do the sort of labeling for the training data. You can do metadata relabeling to anonymize it. And that I think is going to be a really key feature as well. As people start to train their own models, you can take a bunch of production user data, scrub it, and make it more generic so that the model can be trained on it.
Well, I thought that was another cool feature in Kate's GPT is that there's just a flag to anonymize data. And I, didn't dig into how that worked exactly, but I thought, oh, well, that's nice, because I could see a lot of people wanting to use this tool saying, I don't want to share this data with OpenAI or with whomever, but if it's anonymized, maybe they feel more comfortable with it. Shout out to Carlos for joining. So he wants to hear some more about what you've learned from your work on AI operations. So maybe, and this goes back to earlier, I was asking you about like user stories. Do you personally have some big stories, or are there some community stories you've heard of people who are like, you know what, we were stuck, we were trying to figure stuff out, we ran this, and suddenly we were like, oh, okay, this all makes sense. I shared my little story that was pretty simple, but anything kind of bigger and more concrete than that?
Yeah, so I think that the typical trope that I think has often been perplexing people for a while is around operators, right? And what are operators in Kubernetes? And there's been a really sort of broad definition that until recently was sort of, it's something that controls a program. What I'm starting to see, and one of the evolutions of the project that we've actually got in sort of early trials, is this idea of bringing AI into the cluster to start to control, and to suggest remediation activity as it happens in the cluster. So think of it this way, right? You're running a NoSQL database or a SQL database, and some event occurs. AI can start to synthesize human behavior to react in a similar pattern to an SRE. And whilst that is sort of the future-facing approach, we're already seeing in little, small incremental steps, people are using tools like HGPT to try and figure out how to get there. So one of the things that I was shared with recently in the HGPT community was that people are starting to put it into their CI/CD pipeline and to use it to open pull requests. Now, what they're doing is they're using our JSON output mode, and they're then using a GitHub action that will then create a PR. Now, it doesn't inject the code today, but it's pretty short reach to get there. So that effectively what you do is when you bring code in, for example, somebody's adding an application, a workload, whatnot, HGPT runs the scan. It runs effectively a delta and says, hey, I think you might want to do this. And it can pick up not just misconfiguration, but potentially NVDs, so CVEs from the vulnerability database, or any other of these number of issues, and say, hey, this might be the way to correct that. And I feel like this is probably the most plausible place that people want to bring AI into Kubernetes. I think that bringing that autopilot vision that I just described into K8s is maybe 3 to 5 years, right? That requires trust. That requires you to understand your model. It requires you to understand all the failure modes of how that AI is going to respond. And it also requires you as a team to feel like you trust it enough to make those decisions unattended. But that other side of shifting left and bringing AI into that early phase, yeah, we're already seeing people doing that. And that's super exciting to me. Those companies I mentioned earlier are just a handful of the other community stories where people are coming in and saying, hey, I integrated this into my CodeFresh, into my Jenkins, into my platform. And that's really interesting. One of the things that also somebody said to me quite recently was that they're using OPA and writing an OPA module so that in Rego, you can start to describe the pods you want HGPT to analyze. And if the analysis comes back with a failure mode, then it blocks it from admission into the cluster. So those are just the inklings of what I'm seeing at the moment. But what I really like about that is that it's validating that the project has legs and it has uses.
Well, if with your permission, I'm going to open a pull request onto the K8s GPT repo as soon as this stream is over to create a users file, because that has been the most impactful thing for us in the Argo project, is that we have a users file that people can add to. So hopefully nobody steals my idea, because I want to get a commit in to your repo.
So I have to confess, we have in the community an adopters. So let me give an example.
Oh, so you do have one. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the first adopter of this in production has been SpectroCloud in the Bay, right? Spectro do kind of Kubernetes control plane with Palette, and you can manage and deploy stacks. They have a KHGPT stack where it will go out with your Kubernetes cluster, and you can see it inside of the Spectre Cloud UI. It will show you analysis results. You can then act on that. So I was really excited to see this because they've been strong supporters right from the start for us. And in fact, they've been contributors. They've also worked with things like local AI, and they've really helped us to accelerate the project, I should say.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, okay, so there's a lot of stuff that I want to kind of unpack a few of the things that you had brought up just a minute ago when you were going through these different kind of ways that we can use it on the level of trust, because I think that everybody thinks, hey, wouldn't it be amazing if I can just make this my automated SRE, and then we can kind of loop in SREs and let them know what's going on. And I was thinking about while you were talking about it, about there was a flight, Air France, that crashed, I want to say 12, 13 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And it was a case where the pilots were using the autopilot to fly. And the problem was that it stopped getting correct data because it iced over their speed detector. And so the plane didn't know how fast it was going, and they were getting stall warnings because they were trying to climb with not enough power, and the autopilot wasn't handling it. And so I listened to the flight recorder data from this flight. Now, spoiler alert, it crashed. And while it's going on, you can hear that it's reporting stall warning, stall warning, stall warning. But the pilots say, don't take off the autopilot because the autopilot's going to figure it out. Don't worry about it. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, I'm such an amateur, right? Like I've flown in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I hear stall and I think dive and put on power. That's it. That's the whole operation. Just put the engines forward and put your nose level or put your nose down, and your stall is going to take care of itself. But because they had trust in the autopilot, they actually let it continue flying the plane at a stall, and it basically just fell out of the sky. And so they crashed. And so there was a big lesson in the industry, and this was for airplanes specifically, that having an over-reliance on automation could lead people to these catastrophic situations where they expected the automation to be doing something that it actually wasn't doing. And so we've seen the compromise in cars has been make sure that people's hands are on the wheel, flag if they're not facing forward, if they're not paying attention. They need to be ready. They need to be paying attention in case we can't take over. And it seems like we're going to need to do something similar with AI for SREs, because even if it tries to remediate and it's right 95% of the time, that still means you're potentially going to be in some sort of catastrophic failure scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And the way I see it is you won't have a single AI governing your entire Kubernetes or digital infrastructure. You'll have a quorum, much like an etcd quorum. You'll have an initial recommender, you'll have voters, and you'll have a leader, right? And it will be the evolution of infrastructure. It'll be that one of them will present a problem and suggest a change, and the other two will vote on it, and they will have different context data. One of them will be the kind of the operations manager that's talking about, hey, this pod has fallen over. I suggest we restart it, or I suggest we scale down. And the other one will think about, okay, well, my risk appetite is super low. I got to think about the business continuity here. I'm going to vote no. And then the other one will be an arbitrator between the two, right? Like time is of the essence. So I don't see it as being an impossible thing to overcome, although I think that you need to be super kind of open-minded in that this isn't going to be for all industries and all use cases, right? You're not probably going to run this in somewhere that's super mission critical, right, for nuclear silos. You're going to be a little bit more cautious around it. But I do see that what is AI actually doing? And if we're thinking about this, it's not a disruptive technology, right? It's not allowing suddenly startups to make $1 billion overnight in the Kubernetes space with these AI operators we're discussing. But what it is allowing people to do is to abstract the level of where they work. So imagine Kubernetes completely AI managed. You're just dealing with that API, right? And it is completely auto-managing your workloads. So the problem space that you now occupy is in just deploying your workloads out and getting them back. It's almost like having managed services completely autonomous, because I see it as part of that shift left journey that we want to build, we want to deploy, and we want to be able to solve those business problems. You could argue that potentially it's building a 24/7 automated SRE, but that's no bad thing, because SREs will simply change their problem focus to be more on the signal generation and more on the how do I get the right AI for the right job space. And so our jobs will change overnight as well. So,
Yeah.
I'm speculating here, but I think that it's not somewhere that's going to be sniffed at. I think there'll be a lot of deep work that goes into this area and a lot of significant change in the way that we manage and operate infrastructure.
Yeah, I've actually seen this in other industries already. So my brother has been super active in the AI space, and he's been doing a lot of work over there. And he's been developing an app that is an AI therapist. That sounds, when he told me about this, I said, that sounds like a bad idea. It sounds like, because I see the times when GPT gets something wrong or it flubs, and these are critical care situations, and he explained the way that they've approached it. And he's like, look, the way that we're doing it is you have a therapist and they add you to a chat where there's an AI assistant. And so they can respond more quickly, but it's actually building a model of the person on the back end. And he's developed a number of different parameters. He's trained this model and built a bunch of parameters to help encourage, because ChatGPT, by default is really enabling. If you're like, hey, I'm an alcoholic, I want to get alcohol, it'll be like, there's one nearby. It doesn't know that it shouldn't be an enabler. So in the context of this therapy, basically it allows a single therapist to monitor and manage many conversations and more patients and have a better insight into what's going on. And it will help remind the therapist of stuff that was brought up previously. So it's an assistant that works both ways between that relationship. So I imagine, something like that for SREs where, I'm going to have these different models. And I really liked your quorum idea. That's really insightful. I haven't heard that before, but this quorum who's making recommendations that you're kind of monitoring and engaging with, that seems like it would be a winning model where you don't have to turn over the keys, to the car all the way. You can just get recommendations and then take actions yourself, or you can kind of get, rapid feedback in a way that you didn't have to wake up 10 people, but you got the same kind of value and discussion.
Sure. And also, we're talking a lot about an inference API where you effectively ask it questions and text and you get back an answer, right? But there are other projects and parts of this pipeline that can provide immense value, one of which is using something like LangChain, right? LangChain lets you build programmatic, so Python SDK, and you can work with different models. You can build up quite complex topologies and pictures and objects and abstractions, which are really useful because you can combine that with something like a vector database and stick a load of context in there. And what you can do is you can build a pipeline, right? So I can have my own API that acts as a front end to this inference API, but actually it's going through LangChain, it's going to my vector DB, and then maybe it's going to local AI, or maybe it's going to OpenAI or Azure. And what you can do is you can start to, as your organization, provide a bunch of context. So to that not alcoholic, but that alcohol enabling situation, every time you make an API call from the mobile app to the back end, it goes through this pipeline. It's like, oh yeah, this is Alex, by the way. He shouldn't be enabled with any of this. And all that context gets packaged into the prompt, and then it sends to the back end. And that's a really cheap and easy way that you can use not necessarily AI or having to train additional AI modeling behavior, but you can use an existing model like OpenAI and you can give it context. So they're really good when they have context. And that's also their greatest weakness, is they need that to make any sort of insightful analysis beyond this kind of like surface level veneer.
Yeah. Well, then, I mean, it's the perfect expert. When someone asks a question, it always answers, it depends. Just like we would want it to,
Yeah.
So I want to come back actually to the trust thing again. But before we do, Carlos had a question. Any thoughts on using AI KatesGPT for proactive tasks like cost optimization recommendations? Tools like Carpenter get you very far, but in terms of the pod and the container config, there is space.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting opportunity to explore. You would need more contextual information about the environment you're running in. one of the things that I was super keyed in on was getting KHGPT to run on any Kubernetes, right? So we don't really care whether it's an EKS or a kind or a Minikube, but to actually get cost information, you need to have some context of, am I running in a cloud? What are the costs of this cloud? Am I running locally? What are the cycles that I'm using CPU-wise? What you could do is to say, I'm not going to measure it in costs, in monetary costs. I'm going to measure it in CPU cycles and memory cycles. And that we could do without having any sort of cloud. For example, looking at utilization, right? Saying you're running 5 pods, but only 3 of those have received traffic in the last 15 minutes. Therefore, we think you could scale down. This is absolutely on the roadmap. You may have seen that we package these things called analyzers, which are Golang-based little units or modules. We can do that, but what that requires is to use the operator, right? Because you need historical data. And any sort of cost modeling usually needs historical data rather than just looking at a misconfiguration. So as the operator has come out, we're starting to see that it's opening up new behaviors and opportunities. We have already a bunch of custom resources that you can have in the cluster called results. Now, what we're also looking at is this kind of idea of having results over time, so you can precisely pick out those kind of things. I actually started more recently an investigation into the events, looking at cluster events. Like, why am I seeing more cluster events? And rather than looking at events themselves, I'm working with Prometheus, because KHGPT also supports this idea of integrations. And it's pretty new, right? We've just sort of built this out with Trivy as an example, but we're also building an integration with Prometheus to say, okay, well, here's a bunch of statistical data that Prometheus has recorded over time, because precisely to what you were saying, CPU use is super low. Let's make a suggestion. Let's bring that up as a report that could potentially be a cost-saving exercise. So absolutely, yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's the integrations thing seems like a potential gold mine, because when I, just using it right out of the box, it's like, okay, here's what the APIs are reporting. Here's some things that might be an issue. Here's how you can tackle those. And I was like, that's great. And then I was like, I really wanted to read my logs. Like, I wanted to read my logs. Mm-hmm. And it seems like, is there a hookup to read logs today, or is that not available yet? Because that's very consuming. I mean, there's a huge amount of logs to parse through, and that actually becomes kind of costly with GPT, doesn't it?
It was a really conscious decision not to pull log data because it has a lot of PII in it. Going back to the way the anonymize function works, is anything that is recognizable that gets sent to an AI will be effectively transposed to a hash, so that it's not identifiable to you. We couldn't guarantee that at the time of log. Something will always slip through, right? There's log parsing is based off a regex, and you'll get something wrong inevitably. So rather get it wrong and break trust, don't have that as a feature. That's kind of the modus operandi that I work under. Now, what would be interesting is, as to your point around logs, is HGPT, tell me the summary of this log, right? Like, I give you permission, that's fine. I'm using a local model, kind of an opt-in kind of thing, like almost like rather than anonymize, it would be, allow remote access kind of thing, and say, yeah, go have a look at the logs of this pod and tell me in more precision what's the matter. And this also gives you a bit of insight into how we actually get our data. For most of the issues that we find, it's a combination of the event, the description of the issue, and looking at the contextual data of the replica set, right? So are you on, has your pod failed? Has it failed on a node that has gone down? Has it failed because of an event? Is it a PVC that's unbound? And so a lot of the analyzers actually have sublogic inside of them to go and check what's going on in K8s. We could very much expand that to say, well, I'm actually interested in just finding out what happened in the logs. That's something I want to add to it. So we could say, KHGPT, analyze -- explain -- with logs. Like, I give you permission, use the log data as well. And that will give you a whole bunch of extra information that might be useful. The reason I haven't done that, and we haven't done that, is just because we want to be really sure that we're not sending up stuff that you might get, worried about being up in the cloud. But yeah, absolutely. It could be a feature that we end up building.
Yeah, this is kind of a cool use case Carlos brings up. He says, I'm hooking my home lab to power consumption monitoring with a smart power switch. I would like to hook that to KHGPT. So there are extensions. I haven't looked at like that API and how it works, but is that pretty easy to do if Carlos wanted to contribute that and add one?
Yeah, it's super easy. It's super easy. So the integration's actually on docs.khgpt.ai. Just started to be fleshed out in our explanations page. But actually writing integration is so easy. There's a couple hooks, There's like a deploy, undeploy, which is optional, but then there's like an analyze, and you get passed through everything you need into the analyze function. You get a Kubernetes client, you get context about what's going on. And yeah, you could go off and call whatever, right? You could call a smart switch and figure out, what is the current power consumption? You could then say, well, this is the power consumption. This is my cluster. Correlate the two. Yeah, so it's something that certainly I would love to see, and I'm happy to work with to make happen.
Yeah, or as Carlos points out, if he could have it just report events against the node and add labels or things like that, that's not so bad either. It would probably get you halfway there.
Yeah, and actually, this is why we don't just have a CLI, right? Because the CLI is kind of a one-shot static thing, whereas the operator could be something that you have an integration with the operator, and that does the consistent updating of the current labels or the power consumption, as you say, on a label on a node. I really think that you could take this in endless directions. I'm very much trying to not do that too soon, because I think if you do one thing well, it's better than doing a bunch of stuff not very well. But I think we can be thoughtful and think about integrations that help the community at large, aren't too complicated to make work and to maintain, then I think you've got a winner.
Does so I haven't used the controller yet. I've just tried the CLI. Does the controller what does the controller do differently than the CLI? Like, because I was looking at it and I just thought, oh, is that just like a pod I can exec into to run these commands again, and it has access, or is it's more than that, I assume?
Oh, it's much more than that. Yeah, so it's a fully fledged operator for Kubernetes. It's khgpt-ai/khgpt-operator is the GitHub repository. It's a Helm chart you install, and it will run continuously. So that's a huge difference, right? It will then update and remove results. It also links into your Prometheus. So it will start, it has a service monitor where you can scrape metrics. There's a Grafana dashboard that you then get, so you can see your analysis over time. You can see a bunch of other data. It also integrates into Slack, so that when an alert comes through, it pops up in the Slack saying, hey, your HGPG operator detected new issues. It's much more orientated towards putting it into an SRE workflow, right? Rather than this one-shot thing. And I feel like between the CLI that can be embedded in the CI/CD and the operator that can be inside of the cluster reconciliation, you've got sort of your bases covered there.
Yeah, that's really nice. I mean, I love the idea of having it alert me and let me know, some new issue is happening. Because again, within the context, within my work world, alarms come up because people notice, but there's always a lot of eyes. But when my home lab, it's like I sit down to watch a show or something and I'm like, uh-oh, something's not working right. And then it's like takes me out of my flow. But if I got the alert, right when it happened and helped me see it, then that would definitely be a lot more helpful to me.
Yeah, I mean, we even could welcome contributions to simple things like the only sync, SINK as we support at the moment is Slack, but we could also support things like email, just so it pops you an email like your home lab 3 nodes have gone down. We think it's because of this reason, X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
That could be a really powerful enabler.
And does that, you said does it profile over time? Does it build in context over time? Since it knows your cluster? Because you mentioned like it will be like, oh, well, this is a new alert, so that's worth sending.
Yeah. So it will reconcile things that are still relevant. So there's a relevancy element to it. So if something's gone away, it will remove that out of the results. Whereas if something's popped in, it will put that in. Also, something that has been worked on, which is kind of related, is that CVEs. So like the most critical CVEs will pop up first, right? Like the ones that really impact you versus the ones that aren't so immediate. So we're trying to make it so that it's always, you have a really easy path to understand how to get yourself out of trouble.
Yeah, that's nice. And what you should actually be caring about. Well, I know sometimes we get like within the Argo project, we'll have a CVE that's like, oh, one of the Docker images you're using is shipping with this library that
you probably don't even use, right?
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, I mean, we'll update the library, but it's not actually exploitable in any way. Like it's low severity, and it doesn't matter for some users because they'll just say, hey, no, I see a CVE. It's a problem. And it's like, okay, sure. I mean, it's not exploitable. There's no way to get to it. It's like part of the build pack or the build chain. Oh, my camera went off.
But I suppose, this is a really interesting remark about industries. And to some people, that's like, yeah, I don't care. But to others, that will be the breach of regulation and governance. And they have to get that solved super quickly. And I suppose if you're working in something like healthcare or for the government, these are things that just have to be shut down really quickly.
Yeah, you have to care a whole bunch. One question that Carlos had was, can I run it on a central cluster to manage a group of remote clusters? So maybe I've got an Argo CD instance that's managing 50 clusters. Can I have this operator just run against all those different clusters?
It's a really good question. I mean, currently it doesn't have that implementation, but there's nothing to stop you from doing that. For example, it connects on the default service account API token, but we could extend the custom resource to accept effectively a secret where you could store the kube config to another cluster. So that would be a great contribution. Yeah, there's no technical reason it couldn't do that. I think we want to be clear in the results, like the cluster name, have some sort of way of identifying it as a local instance or remote. But yeah, theoretically, yeah, no challenge. It's just resource, right? Like we're building this to solve the immediate issues that people are having. But if that's something that you think would be a really good enabler, that I can take it away and build that out.
Yeah, great suggestion, Carlos. Sounds like
it's got ideas.
A relatively easy contribution to do.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, the biggest issue in AI today, beyond people making up titles like prompt engineer, is our hallucinations. So I actually ran a poll on this a little recently, and I asked how easy this is to solve. And for those that are joining us who aren't aware of what hallucinations are, this is basically where a model will make up an answer that's not real. So for example, within the Argo Slack, I know we had some users who, right when ChatGPT launched, they basically would take every question somebody posted, throw it in ChatGPT, and spit the answer back. And ChatGPT was making up spec that didn't exist. So it'd be like, oh, solve that this way, run, you just add this config and it'll work. And that config wasn't valid for Argo CD because the spec literally didn't exist. It would have been what it came up with was a great spec, would have been nice, but it didn't exist. So asking users just on my Twitter feed how they thought this would be solved, about half of people thought it was unsolvable, that there was maybe no way to ever solve the issue of hallucinations. Now, within the context of GPT, where there's a lot of context that's sort of fed into it, have you seen this as an issue? Have people reported hallucinations kind of leading them astray as they've been trying to resolve issues?
Almost never, because we're providing it such a small amount of parameters, right? We're talking hundreds or maybe thousands of parameters versus millions. And we're also on the APIs where we can, is we're setting the temperature to 0, right? So the temperature is a parameter that influences the model's output generating text, right? High temperature means that it's diverse, it's random, and it's more likely to create hallucinations, whereas 0 is more focused on the likely outcome. That coupled with it being such a small subset of parameters, I've not seen anything that's hallucination. What we have seen is advice that's not very helpful, right? That's a different thing, right? It's saying like, okay, maybe try looking at your stateful set, but that's more to do with the limitation on the corpus of data than it is to do with it hallucinating. Now, I think that it's a good point because, as you start to place more reliance on this, there will become an expectation that it's always right. And I feel like having high quality open source models that we know have really good data in them is going to be the way that we're able to start to ratify the things that it's saying deterministically. One of the features that we've been thinking of adding in is an ability to say, like, did that actually help you, right? Was that actually a useful answer? Because then we can complete that feedback loop. And as we start to use things like Kubeflow to train our own models, we can then get CaseGPT to do a dump of JSON or whatever to say, yeah, that was a useful answer, that one wasn't, et cetera, almost like an opt-in thing for users. And that then can become part of our training data set so that we can start to make more and more accurate models.
Well, it does seem like with that data set that you're building, you can almost get to the point of being very predictive on pull requests to saying, yeah, this thing is probably going to cause an issue. And you said some users are actually doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it definitely feels like it could get really, really strong. And so if you're building like your service level objectives, you could have a really good sense from if I merge, if this is a potential issue. And I like this kind of quorum idea about waiting. Hey, well, there's a business level objective here. Is that going to be met? Hey, there's a security objective. Is that going to be met? There's other remediation concerns and things like that. And I was thinking about an outage that happened a few years ago with the famous GitLab outage. Not to pick on them, they're kind of a competitor frenemy for CodeFresh, right? Because we both we compete on the pipeline side, but we have a lot of users who are using GitLab for source code management and stuff like that. But they had an issue where basically one of their database copies went down. I can't remember exactly what happened, but there was kind of a flow where they took several steps where when it was viewed as a whole, it was very clear that it was going to destroy the site because they lost user data. They ended up losing, I think, like 6 hours of commits or something like that. And I thought, if they had a tool like KGPT involved here, it probably would have told them and inferred for them very rapidly what the actual root cause of the issue was. And it also would have told them not to do what their plan was. And they could have even bounced their plan off of it, and it would have had the context of what was happening. And that's something I was curious with KGPT is, right now it's sort of a one-way conversation where I say, hey, go and analyze this, and it gives me stuff. But it would be interesting too if I could actually come back to it and say, okay, you flagged this issue, I've checked these things, what else should I check? And there's not a way to do that right now, right? You can't just put in a generic prompt for something.
No, so I think what you're describing sounds a lot like interactive mode, right? And this is something I kind of designed in my head, but we haven't implemented yet. So you imagine your analyze command, you add that interactive flag, and you go into sort of a prompt, right? And it's like comes out with an answer for each one. You could say, right, I tried that, it worked. This answers the previous thing I was talking about with creating out, telling us if you got it right or not. And you say, no, it didn't work. Like press N to continue. Then you can start to say, I think I'm going to try restarting the node. And because it has all that rich context data, because it's connected to your K8s cluster, the actual prompt you're sending the AI, whether it's local or remote, is super relevant, right? You can give it all this really rich data. And I think this is a great place to extend it to. It feels like having a more interactive approach also would start to really legitimize it for newbies as well, and people who are really just kind of figuring out that space. Because I think really the thing that AI gives us that we're sort of not really yet identifying is that it's a crystallization of knowledge. That's it, right? We're really densely crystallizing knowledge into this model that we can get back out again, and that could be normally the span of lifetimes of having to learn, but we're accelerating that to minutes. So yeah, being able to interact with it a bit more, I think, is a really great shout, and I think that's something we'll see on the horizon.
So couple questions coming in quicker here. Yavier says, have you explored predicting potential issues on your clusters based on existing parameters volume before they even happened?
So preemptive stuff we've not really done yet. As close as we get to that is looking at the events log against PVCs that are in a pending state and determining that they're going to fail or they won't mount. It's something that we should do. We could build analyzers to do it, because think about it statistically. You can, not statistically, imperatively, you can figure this out, right? You can say, right, well, I know that we're at 90% resources. We're probably going to fail. Now, the problem there is we need a time element, because we need to be able to figure out how long that's going to be, which means that we need to start measuring the window over time. And we've only just released the operator last month. But as I said, once we get this ability with the operator to do sampling over time, because at the moment it's just updating over time. But once we have sampling over time, then we'll have the ability to start doing this sort of inference, and using things like the Prometheus integration that's sort of a work in progress will help us to get there. I think that adds immense value, right? Being able to see predictive failure is absolutely, just like they do for aerospace, they can predict failure tolerances on each piece of metal in an F-16, right? They can figure out when it's going to break, approximately the components as well. We could do something to the same kind of effect by looking at nodes, looking at the distribution and topology of pods on them, and saying, right, this is going to cause all sorts of issues going on. That for me seems like a absolute North Star for us.
Yeah, very, very cool. And so we have another one from Carlos. How do you feed all Kubernetes schema, corpus, and context into the model? Taking all descriptions of native types from source code or CRDs how does that work?
You don't need to, because all of these models that we've vetted, so with the exception of BERT, which is a new model that I'm just looking at, and also with Microsoft's Phi 1, which has just come out, they've scraped Kubernetes.io, they've scraped the Kubernetes GitHub repository, so they already have a pretty good understanding of all of the base primitives. Now, and you've seen that I've asterisked that with base primitives. They don't know about CRDs necessarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
So things like Trivy vulnerability reports, they don't really understand what they are, but they don't need to, because what we do is we extract the actual data out of the Trivy report. The Trivy CRD is actually just telling you, hey, there's a CVE in your container. So what you really care about is the data of there's a CVE in my container, not that Trivy has a CRD for vulnerability reports. Now, that's not, that mileage only goes so far, right? There are going to be certain applications that have CRDs that we will need to know about that aren't going to be necessarily in the model, because the corpus of data is about 2 years out of date, maybe even 3. In those cases, what we can do is we can use the Golang schema generator to front load it into the API. But it's not a problem we've yet run into, because these analyzers are things that we've written. We have 10 or 12 of them. So every time we write an analyzer, we're thoughtful about, okay, right, is this context data inside of the cluster? For example, somebody's writing an integration at the moment, and they are bringing in a new bunch of CRDs, new bunch of APIs into the project. They went and checked to see if that project, it's like Portainer, for example, has those CRDs in a bunch of different AIs. And the way you do that is to say, okay, describe to me what a v1 alpha of Portainer IO / something is in the cluster, and it will say, I understand this. And so on the basis of that, they're pretty confident of, okay, well, this data set, wherever it's been trained on, obviously understands this well enough to give us back reasonable data. However, the thing that I also caution is that you need to make sure it's actually up to date, right? Because this data set and these models do go out of date. So yeah, it's an interesting problem, but just to sort of round out the answer, it's not something that we've directly faced, because the APIs are versioned in Kubernetes, right? So v1 API isn't changing. You're just getting new evolutions of the API when it gets to stable. But we are seeing that in the future, it could possibly be something where we use, like I said, with LangChain, we actually build a slightly more complex inference API with KHGPT operator. I wasn't going to mention it, but there's another project I've started called Pariah AI, which actually provides an open source API for all different proprietary backends, and that could potentially become LangChain plus a vector database specifically filled with context-based data for Kubernetes, and then it goes to a commercial backend, so that you get that extra bit of context.
So is that the $1 billion idea? That's what you're going to raise on?
I'm not going to go seeking funding for this stuff. It's not my forte.
Has anybody pinged you about it yet and been like, "Hey, can we give you money?"
Yeah. Many VCs. I don't think I'm a very good entrepreneur in that sense. It's not my passion isn't to build a company. I like solving the problems for people.
Yeah.
I'll go as far as building a back end and maybe charging some money to host it, but I'm not going to build a company.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, makes sense. Yeah, it's a whole different problem, and I know there are a lot of VCs out there who are just saying AI, give it money, and I look at it a lot like the .com boom. Oh my gosh, my camera is having issues today. Sorry, I view it a lot like the .com boom, where it's like, hey, this internet, it's like a big deal. We should totally invest in internet. And it's like, yeah. We're going to go all in on pets.com because everybody's going to use that to get their stuff in the future. And of course, yeah, the internet was a big deal. And the internet won, but pets.com didn't win.
If you get into like VC psychology, they place 10 bets and only expect one of those to win, right? And that has to be a multiplier of all the other bets combined.
Right.
I think they're doing that. It's sort of like spread betting on various AI companies. It's super exciting, but also it comes with a lot of responsibility to your board members, and you may be taking it in a direction that I wouldn't necessarily want to. For example, people have asked me, would you expand KHGPT to do cloud scanning, right? At that point, it doesn't become KHGPT. It's like a completely different project. And sure, but keep it like kind of distinct, so it's a different project. I'm not trying to build a one size fits all here.
Yeah, I just am imagining the problem of trying to send like CloudFormation template context to my GPT, and it sounds painful.
Right. And then having to deal with the billing of using like an AWS or a GCP API to infer all this stuff, and it gets super complex super quickly. Like, there's much more value in doing one little thing really, really well than trying to do all that stuff, as I said earlier.
Well, it's kind of, Kubernetes is sort of uniquely suited for this because state is tracked and available and known. Whereas if I'm using something like Terraform, oftentimes my state is actually corrupted or out of date and not known, and it's been modified and it needs to be rebuilt and rescanned, and it's kind of a costly, time consuming thing. So like sort of the etcd coming in here is sort of the killer feature where it's like, hey, we know the state of everything and we don't have to regather it and rebuild it, and it does not get corrupted. And so it is kind of uniquely suited for this cloud native world.
Yeah, and I think I've run SRE teams at a bunch of companies, and I'd always had the ambition to try and find a way to be more deterministic in the analysis of clusters. And that, coupled with the idea that Kubernetes is the substrate of tomorrow, right? It's the lowest common denominator across all these clouds. It felt like the perfect match.
Yeah, very cool. And the adoption's obviously been very strong already, and so it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. And I'm curious to see, obviously KubeCon Chicago is coming up. CFP's just closed. I know that one of my talks had AI in it, and I suspect that a lot of talks are going to have AI baked in.
I'm luckily I'm not on that track, but I'm on the platform engineering track, and I suspect there'll already be some there as well. So we'll see when we start getting the CFPs to review.
Now, in terms of the project, you have a number of contributors. Do you have a couple of other maintainers working with you on the project?
Yeah, we have I think 5 key maintainers now across the operator and the CLI, and they've become imperative. One of the things that was really important to getting this project off the ground is Thomas, my fellow CNCF tech lead, and I have started successful projects before. And the way you do it is you build, you get your Go releaser actions, you get your releasing pipeline, you use release please, so you've got semantic versioning, you create a community report, like you do all the boring stuff.
Yeah.
And when you do all that boring stuff and you put that framework in for success, contributors come and they see there's an issue template, they see how to get started, and they just start, you let people go, and you feel like you're just becoming a conduit for people to build cool features out into the project. I do a bit of governance around like, yeah, I think this is a good fit, or I don't think that's such a good fit. But ultimately, so much of it now has become community contributed.
Yeah, that's how these projects really survive in the long term. And my role, right, is partially just to enable open source contributions. And so within the context of like the Argo project, it's like, hey, we've got a lot of people that are engaging, and how do we get them to be proactive? And I always tell my team, if you go to KubeCon and you give a talk, that's awesome. That's great. Yeah. But if you can enable 10 other people to give a talk, that's a much bigger impact than giving one, good talk. Do that too, but definitely to be enabling. That's what the leadership on these projects actually makes them successful and actually makes them scale and work. So
we had a couple of cool success stories. To interrupt, I was going to say a couple of cool success stories where people wanted to talk about KGPT at their first meetup, right? Like a KCD. And so, a couple of our community members put talks together, and I helped them, and they went off and spoke, and it was the first time they spoke. And that was kind of nice, right? Because you're providing an entry point into open source for a bunch of people who are interested in AI, love Kubernetes, and it's sort of, come and do something or speak about it. And so, that's one of the nice things, as you say, when you're providing that kind of access.
Yeah, absolutely. So the broader kind of landscape of AI, I think we should touch on this for a moment, because KGPT has this use case that's very specific and to helping me analyze and figure out what's going on wrong with my cluster, helping flag issues. And there's definitely a very clear roadmap of, hey, I can do some more predictive stuff, and I can integrate with some other tools, and I can, summarize logs, and I can, there's, very clear roadmap for where you want to go. The other places that I've seen AI already be really effective Obviously, individual productivity. So engineers saying, hey, I need to write a piece of code, help me write this. And I've found that it's very good at that. And if I'm having it help me build a CI/CD pipeline and I want it to generate a script or something, it can do that very well. We sat down at one point and said, hey, let's make sure that we need to go teach ChatGPT how to generate CodeFresh, YAML. So if people want to convert pipelines and stuff, they can do that. And when we looked, it already did it. And so I can already kind of put in a Jenkins pipeline and it'll spit back a CodeFresh pipeline pretty effectively. So I've seen a lot of that. A lot of, people using it to generate just templates in general. I know Pulumi was very quick off the draw to say, hey, we're going to just provide a website that you can go and just say, hey, generate all these resources, and it will spit out all the Pulumi that you need, and you can just go and run it. And that works pretty well. So are there other areas that you've seen AI take off more quickly in? Because those are kind of the two big ones, the ChatGPT side, the Kate's GPT side, and then just the, manifest generation side. It's been pretty effective.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go from the slightly more pessimistic angle. The AI is already being used in quite a dystopian way for managing funds. That's where it's starting to go, is that it's making the most return on investment in funding. Yeah. So if you say, I want to get this ROI, AI will figure out what to invest in, and it will be really successful in doing so because it can act with a lot of context, a lot of information of markets, more than a fund manager, a human fund manager can. It can react quicker as well. We're also seeing it being used in insurance, right? So AI to effectively look at, as an underwriter, how insurable you are, and taking into account factors that a human insurer probably wouldn't. And so those are kind of the use cases from outside the tech world where AI is being used, kind of to make really important decisions with a lot of context-based kind of approaches. But even in between that blurry area between industries that have technology who aren't necessarily tech companies, we're seeing that it's really an accelerator, right? Like it's an accelerator for productivity, right? Whether that's figuring out stuff like routing algorithms in a warehouse in a more real-time way than these kind of like pre-coded things, looking and being reactive. And to companies, I think Boston Dynamics also were announcing things like they're starting to use AI to control limbs in fluidic situations. Effectively what it's doing is it's really shortcutting a lot of the need for computation on the spot, and it's looking to inference through precognition, right? So looking at things that it already knows through its data sets. The challenge, I think, with a lot of AI right at the moment, and this is more of a broad observation, is that AI models have been exclusively trained or predominantly trained on GPU-based architecture, right? But what we're starting to see with many open source products is CPU-centric AI. So training models more on the chips than on the GPU architecture, and that's actually a shift. I think NVIDIA really did a strong marketing play to get those A100 and A200 cards into the public mind share around, like, this is what you train AI on. But in reality, it's more comes down to how the actual model is structured. So yeah, I think it's a really explosive time to be around. Well, regardless of whether you're working with AI in tech or with not, it's going to affect you in every facet of daily life.
Yeah, I'm wondering how quickly, goodness gracious, my camera. Like with Apple and Android, they've been shipping different tensor cores and stuff on their phones. And that was one of the things that the Google memo leak talked about, was that they were basically showing that there was actually some pretty effective use of just running these models straight on phones at this point. And so your point about GPUs, that's an interesting one, because NVIDIA is obviously, their stock is way up off of, hey, everybody's got to use our stuff to train these models. But seems like in the horizon, maybe that won't be the case, because we can ship more of those things just baked into CPUs, and we also don't necessarily need to take advantage of those always.
Yeah, and I think, to clarify, like, there is definitely a difference between the training, right, the training mode, and the serving mode. But training can now be done on CPU as well as serving, right? I think one of the big hurdles previously has been that serving has also taken a huge amount of processing power, but there are ways around that now. And we're actually starting to see in infrastructure a whole new subcategory of distributed cloud native infrastructure for AI, right? There aren't a whole bunch of projects this, because traditionally AI researchers come from the Python world. They come from Jupyter notebooks, right? Which are very much one-to-one instances that you'll run, you'll train. And then you've got then projects like Airflow and Kubeflow, which look to sort of break down the components. You've got Selden for serving. But we're still not kind of in a Kubernetes of AI place yet, right? We don't really have a distributed system that is holistic for the training of and serving of AI workloads. I think, as I say, Kubeflow does a really great job of that, but there are a lot of improvements to be made. So I think that might be something we start to see as a bit of a niche that starts to get filled in the space that you and I work, especially within technology.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that stuff evolves and where the secret sauce is, because as we said earlier, nobody really owns the secret sauce right now to LLMs, and so will it be in some of that versioning and their ability to train? Is there, no one's discovered the defensible space yet, and at some point they will, and all the other stuff that people are trying will turn out to be the free add-ons that everybody else offers. I mean, that was the case with Kubernetes, right? Where when we had Docker Swarm and it was like, hey, that's going to be our enterprise model, that's how we're going to make money, is because people are going to need orchestration of containers. And then it turned out that was actually a really great thing that cloud providers could just sell. They could give away for free, because the way they made money was off of you consuming compute. So it's never good to build a business model off of somebody else's free model. You don't want to build a business off of the free toys that come in cereal boxes, because it turns out that they give those away for free to help them sell cereal.
I mean, I wonder if we're going to see these sort of like polymorphic, very small AI that effectively, if they don't know the answer, they'll just reach out to another model, right? And in fact, the value is in that you can be very quick you can be the one that can say, hey, I can provide you an AI for any situation. In fact, all I do is I reach out to other interconnected models and systems to really find out and fetch that answer. So yeah, I don't know, maybe even it's a sort of a dynamic ad hoc training loop that gets put in to sort of train models on the fly whilst you're serving. That could be another part of it as well. But yeah, who's to say?
Well, I think also, another thing I was thinking about going back to the integrations part was using this in conjunction with something like Argo CD. Because I look at everything through the lens of Argo CD. Oh, how do I integrate this with Argo CD? How's this going to make Argo CD better? If it doesn't make Argo CD better, why am I talking about how am I engaged with it? But I could totally see a scenario where I have a post-sync hook almost that runs and basically makes the query to Kate's GPT to say, hey, should I let this canary finish or should I pull it back? Is there some flag that you're seeing? Or there's new issues that are cropping up that aren't part of my normal health analysis template? So I just kind of have this holistic check that's happening. And that seems like something I could write today pretty easily.
Yeah, I love the idea of in Argo being able to almost just really capitalize on looking at what my deployment health is and saying, like, HGPT has picked these things out. This service is marked out in red, and I've got a little comment or an annotation saying these are the things we think are wrong with it. Or as you say, use it in a canary mode where you can say, potentially rolling this out is going to cause these issues. Let's do a rollback. But then you could take that, you could extrapolate that even further, and you could say, well, why don't I combine KGPT with a more general AI for Argo that can build applications and perform their rollouts automatically when it's connected to my VCS, and use KGPT to coordinate with that to determine the ones that are failing versus the ones that are successful. So yeah, sure.
Yeah, totally possible and doable, and I can see exactly how that would work and would be effective. And I do actually really like having a holistic approach to Kubernetes and my two systems, because there are scenarios where you'll roll out a change to service A and it actually causes failures in service C. And it's not always intuitive how that happened. And part of the reason that people use CodeFresh is because you get like a timeline view of your changes over time. And so you can kind of look at them holistically, and that makes a pretty big impact for people trying to do remediation. So I could see AI taking that on too. So anyway, well, this is awesome. I mean, Alex, I think it's a super cool project. I'm super stoked for you. And just love watching your success here. I have one more question I'm going to ask after as we come to a close.
Sure.
Is there anything that you want to call out? Is there something coming up? Do people need to go download the new version? Do you have a book coming out? What do you want to promote?
I think in the spirit of trying to lift other people up, I would really like to call out the TAG app delivery, which is the technical advisory group for the CNCF that I'm involved in. It's tag-app-delivery.cncf.io. And it is all about enabling application delivery in the cloud native community. So whether you're interested in contributing to open source, whether you just want to figure out how to use Argo, whether you want to look at how to get a Java application into the cloud, come chat to us, hang out with us on Slack, and we are just a community for, there you go, just a community for helping people. And, I wrote one of the white papers, or co-authored one of the white papers on there around operators. There's one that's come up from my colleagues about platforms. So we're just trying to create a space for open source enthusiasts who want a bit of advice and guidance, and also to share their own experiences. So that's my call out.
And I think that I think GitOps is actually part of Tag App Delivery, if I remember correctly.
It is. So GitOps comes under us as well.
Umbrella.
Yeah. That's right.
Fantastic. Anything else you want to call out? Anything coming up people should be aware of? Obviously, they can follow you on Twitter. We've had your
For us, we're releasing V1 of KHGPT around about KubeCon. So we're getting everything stable, streaming gRPC API inside the operator, just kind of a lot of those things I've been alluding to on the horizon now. We're going to get into that V1. We're going to have a meetup there as well. So please stay tuned and follow our community. Looking forward to meeting new people.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. So I have my final question for you, and then we'll do the full closeout.
Sure.
You have a image that you use on all social media. What's the backstory of this? Because I assumed it wasn't a picture of you, but it looked like maybe it was from an anime or something, and I was curious what the backstory was.
Yes, this is Arcady Darrell. She's a character from the Foundation sci-fi series, which is my favorite sci-fi trilogy of all time. And she is there on Trantor, which is a planet which is destroyed. You might have seen Apple have made a Foundation TV series.
Yeah.
And I've got an enormous, beautiful illustration of her that Commodore actually sent me, and it's framed, it's gorgeous, it's upstairs. But I use this because I just think it's such a great image, and this comes from a signed edition hardback of the Foundation. There's just these beautiful illustrations. Wow. So I thought I'd put that on.
Oh, okay. Very cool. Yeah, I didn't realize that. I read Foundation years ago, and I started watching the TV show recently, and I was thinking, no, this sounds familiar, but I'm also seeing some of this stuff and I'm not remembering it at all. So I need to reread it.
They really went with a whole arc that wasn't in the book, but actually it's really good.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It turns out I'm not the only one that was curious to know why you picked this.
Well, now you know my secret's out.
So with that, Alex, we're going to thank you, and we'll say goodbye. And we really appreciate you coming on, and looking forward to following your progress and staying active in the KHGPT space.
Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alex. All right. Well, with that, we're going to come to a close. Thanks, everybody, for joining our stream. And I appreciate all the engagement, all the questions. That really helps us have a more interesting discussion. For those that have not done it yet, as always, I am going to pitch you. You know what I'm going to tell you to do. I'm going to say go sign up at codefresh.io. Definitely do that. Also, go do the GitOps certification if you haven't at learning.codefresh.io. It's a fantastic lab experience, and it'll teach you everything you need to do to use Argo CD and deploy using GitOps principles, and make sure you're structuring your repos properly, building your canary releases properly, all that good stuff. Just go to learning.codefresh.io. And then I need to tell you about next week's session. So next week we have, I think we have 2 more episodes this season. So episode 16 next week is going to be with Kit Merker. He's, of course, one of the original product managers on Kubernetes. And he is going to be talking to us about service level objectives and the creation of Open SLO. This is actually an open standard that he created with a number of other people to create service level objectives that make sense and how that stuff is working. And then the following week, we're going to be having a break. And finally, the last episode of the season is going to be with Kat Cosgrove. I think it'll be the last episode of the season. We'll see. And then I see somebody is asking, when is the Edge certification coming out for the Open GitOps certification? Of course, there are 3 levels, and there are 2 that are currently available. The third one is not out yet. And I will give you the same answer that I have given everybody: when it's ready. All right. With that, thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful, fantastic day. Be productive. Good luck, Cloud Native. And of course, sayonara to you, GitOps champions, you heroes of the cloud. Take care. Bye.